trying to conserve culture in post-Katrina New Orleans. And the damage was severalfold. First of all, it's all the physical damage that images like this represent, with flooding and fires and the chaos that ensued. Secondly, it's really the psychological damage. And I still see that on a daily basis. You live in a city that was 550,000 people, it went down to about 210, and now it might be topping close to 300,000. And of those, many of those people lost everything they had overnight. And it's a city that's still on edge 3.5 years later. It's a city that's still witnessing failures of politicians and structures from the highest federal level to the lowest local level. So there's a great deal of frustration. The Ogden was the first museum to reopen after Katrina. We had a staff meeting in September, barely a month after the storm, and decided that since our building wasn't damaged, that we would reopen. We reopened in October with 2 new shows and a publication, and charted a course from October until the anniversary of Katrina that looked at 2 things: the mess we were in and the culture at risk because of that mess. So we made 7 shows about architecture and rebuilding New Orleans. We changed our programming to become very local, to reflect those artists and those people that were at risk because of Katrina. And we also were very active in saving collections, both individual works and in some cases 4 or 5 large bodies of work. Nothing can kind of prepare you for the challenge. We have a very good emergency plan, and living right on the rim of the Gulf, we had enacted it 4 times before Katrina, which is battening down the museum, getting everything as well prepared as possible, and then those of us that leaving in time not to be caught in the city. And this time, the way Katrina unfolded, there were things that I'd never thought about. For instance, the inability to get a truck. When we needed to move art, there were no trucks literally from Miami past Houston. And I had large works of art that I needed to move. Richard White, who's going to come and join me in a moment, is a painting conservator, and he had been working with the Ogden collection for years before I came. And he and I immediately started working together. So we had this history of a partnership of working on the Ogden collection. And with a small staff like ours, people like Richard literally becomes an adjunct staff member, not only for his skill in repairing damaged paintings, but his advice on framing, restretching, storage. So you develop these relationships, as your museum here does, with people that have the expertise and the ability to advise you in these areas. I had a storage room that was off-site from the museum that flooded. It was about 6 miles from any source of water. And I went and looked at it in the rain, and we'll see some photographs of it in a moment. And Richard also had his studio in the upstairs area of this building. The building itself flooded on the ground floor, and the roof peeled back, and the rainwater came in from above. So you both got it from above and below. And the damage that we had compared to the catastrophic state of the building was fairly slight. A few of the paintings were large and in upcoming exhibitions, and Richard will say a bit about his relocation temporarily to Mobile, Alabama. But I was faced with the problem with Richard, who was just down the road, suddenly being in Mobile with no trucks. And fortunately in New Orleans, we like to drink a little bit, because there was one bar named Molly's in the quarter that never closed. And when we were there working, just a few of us in the museum, I decided to stop by there one evening for a little relaxation, and also just to patronize this bar that decided to stick it out through it all. And there I met these guys from New York who were art movers. And they had rented trucks, and they were moving antiques from New Orleans to Chicago. The loss of furniture, the loss of paintings, the loss of book collections is really startling when you get under the surface of things just a bit. And they offered, when they were finished hauling this furniture up to Chicago and coming back through, to pick up the paintings that I had in the storage room, for which I had no truck large enough. I was literally reduced to moving art in the back of a pickup truck owned by my building manager, and hiring his two nephews who had never handled art ever before, working very closely with me to help with some of the manpower. It's literally, in these situations, just guerrilla warfare, and you're improvising as you go. And somehow you get it done. The dotted lines are not direct paths. You kind of take tangents and eventually find your way there. And these images, of course, came to us, CNN. I was evacuated to South Carolina with my family, and the morning the storm was hitting, I was reading the paper and wondering what was going on, and my wife Linda looked across the room at me and said, "Why don't you try the landline?" And I looked at her and said, "Major Category 4 storm hitting the city of New Orleans, and I'm just supposed to walk over here and pick up the phone and talk to the museum?" She said, "You could try." So she left the room, and I'm still reading the paper, and kind of looked at the phone once or twice, and I made sure that she was busy in the back of the house, and went over, dialed the number, and my guard picks up the phone. "Ogden Museum, this is Don." And I said, "Don?" He said, "Who is this?" And so we finally were startled at what was going on, that I was far enough away and the lines were underground, no cell phones worked. And so for the next few weeks, everyone in New Orleans that had a phone could call me in South Carolina, and I could call the people they wanted to talk to in Louisiana and tell them to meet at so-and-so or connect them in a way that just made no sense at all. But we were communicating. So for the next few weeks, I talked to Don every 4 hours, and I was telling him what was happening in and around him with what I was seeing on CNN, and he was looking out the door and telling me what was happening on the street. It was a very interesting dialogue, and often the two were at odds. And what he told me was, the first day after the storm, with the exception of the looting on Canal Street, where people wanted 12 pairs of tennis shoes that didn't fit them anyway and thought it was something they really needed to go through the window and get, he said the city was by and large calm. So the second day, when people were running out of what little water they had and really needed help, that people were out on the street more, but in a daze. And by the third day, after the magnitude of the flooding was known and people realized that the cavalry wasn't coming, that was the time that people just snapped and the chaos really began. Fortunately, he was there. We had 2 guards. The museum became a safe haven for not only their families, but families of people that they knew. We had food, water, sleeping, shower, water to flush toilets with, and there are 5 major doors between the outside and our art vault. And as part of our preparedness, we take the most sensitive and the most valuable pieces and lock them in this vault, and the entire museum literally becomes a vault. So if we could flip through some images. This is what greeted me on at my house when I returned: a yard full of debris, the waterlogged paper the day before the storm. Okay. This is the flooding in the city. The darkish purplish parts are the worst of the flooding, where it was 10 feet or more. 80% of the city was flooded. And I would say of the 80% that was flooded, most of it is still seriously damaged. There are neighborhoods that are coming back very slowly, where there'll be city blocks with 1 restored house and 3 or 4 square blocks with absolutely no one. A couple of the communities that are closer to town are coming back really well. But what effectively happened is that entire populations were purged from New Orleans, some of them purposefully so, with the tearing down of 5,000 public housing units in the year and a half after Katrina. These people weren't even allowed to go back and get their belongings. The houses were, big earth movers came in and took the houses down, and the belongings were just churning in the debris. I was working with the photographer Elliot Irwin at the time, and we breached one of the fences and went in, and he was just absolutely stunned at kind of the symbolism of the personal tragedies of all these belongings in this debris. And the housing projects were low-rise housing projects. There weren't the big dire projects like in larger cities, and buildings were built pre-World War II, so they were quite substantial buildings. In fact, they had quite a bit of trouble tearing them down. So the chaos, these are some of those projects that were torn down. You see low-rise, fairly substantial buildings. My custodian told me that he was told to pack a bag and wait on his front steps and that buses would come for him. And he got his young daughter and his grandmother, sat there. The bus didn't come, they went back to sleep, and were awakened the next morning with water coming over the bed, and were rescued off the roof by a passing boat. A lot of the sportsmen of Louisiana were the heroes. It wasn't so much the officials, it was guys with boats that just hooked them up and came to New Orleans and started pulling people out of their homes. Not that the others weren't. This is Rampart Street, not too far, and it's where the flooding started narrowing on the edge of the French Quarter. Next. The debris, the signage, the refrigerators, the ad hoc signage. I wish I had the presence and the time to have documented and saved all of the extraordinary signs and things that were sprayed. The sense of humor, one of the great things about New Orleans is the indomitable spirit that all of this hasn't damaged at all. This is a badly pixelated, we did an exhibition with the great photographer Robert Polidori, and this is Lakeview. These houses had water up to the gutter lines for a considerable period of time. And one of the things that I think has not been clearly communicated through the news media is the democracy of the flood. It hit rich, it hit poor. Some people had much fewer resources to recover. But this is a neighborhood that's not recovering well, and it's middle and upper middle class, mixed white and black. The human toll is the extraordinary thing, and I think these stories will never be told. Several of us have tried to tell them in exhibitions, and some of the photographs, if you get down to the Ewing Gallery at the university, some of them tell the human tale of Katrina. Tom Neff is a professor at LSU, and he and I did a project together. David Ray Morris is a photojournalist, and he started sending me photographs in September from all up and down the Gulf Coast via email. And by the time that I made it back to New Orleans, we already agreed that his would be the opening show at the museum in October, which documented the storm, the flood, and the human aftermath. This greeted me when I came to town the first day back, the Superdome with the roof off, with the consequences you know. What this means for all of us in the museum world is significant. This is the Ore Museum that was designed by Frank Gehry in Biloxi, Mississippi. It's right on the Gulf. And what you're looking at are the pavilions of the museum with the zigzag roof. And what you see behind it that looks like a building is not a building. It's a casino barge that washed out of the Gulf, slammed into the Gehry buildings. And this thing with the barnacles all over it is the barge, and this is the Gehry Pavilion here. One more. And there's the backside of the barge. Now what's remarkable is I took someone there with me, and I was examining the situation. This is US 90, a sidewalk the beach and the Gulf just right there. And I said, now what's unusual about this barge sitting there? And they looked and they said, what do you mean? I said, we have beach, sidewalk, barge. All the light poles were still up, which meant that this barge came across the top over the power lines and the light poles on a 34-foot storm surge. This thing had to be cut apart piece by piece and hauled away. The Ore Museum is still trying to get back on their feet. This is the Ogden. The art starts on the 3rd floor. It's 30-some feet above ground level. It was purposefully designed that way. This is our atrium. This is the building that flooded. I took this building because it had an 18-wheel loading dock, and the floodwaters got to here to get into the room. And you can see how high that is above street level. And as I said, it's 5 or 6 miles from any source of water. And this trailer is still there. The debris is gone. But 3.5 years later, people are still living in FEMA trailers. That was my last image, so there's some in the middle that are Richard's. So Richard, why don't you come up and say a few words about your saga of having to flee to Mobile and some of the challenges that faced you with conserving Katrina images. I'll get it over to Steve.
Yeah, I would like to make my own little preface about my experience with Katrina, because, of course, Katrina was in all the news at the time, but it's one instance that I know where what it was really like and what was on the news media was worse in real life. And it's all like a kind of a bad dream. And my wife and I had evacuated to Little Rock, Arkansas, expecting to come back in 2 or 3 days, because that's the way it's always been in New Orleans. You evacuate and you come back and everything's fine. And so when the flooding hit New Orleans and I found out about that, I was staying with my brother and sister-in-law. Had started making some decisions. And I had sources in New Orleans who would tell me what was going on. And it became obvious that we were going to have to move someplace, because even though our house, which is close to Tulane University, was not damaged except for the yard, and it was pretty much a disaster. But the house was fine, except the burglars broke in when we were evacuated and vandalized the house. But that's another question. But I very quickly decided we had to set out work, because I knew there was going to be a lot of work coming very soon. And so we moved to Mobile, and I was able to eventually, it took a few days, but I would find a place to set up a studio. And it was in a Catholic school that was not a real old school, but was no longer active. And so I rented 2 large classrooms and a principal's office. And so I had a pretty nice amount of space to prepare for the transportation of artworks to the studio. And within a month, I had 450 paintings, which is kind of, to me, was overwhelming and unimaginable. And so in those 2 classrooms, there were paintings everywhere. I had to lean them against the wall in layers, was separated by cardboard, and just to prepare to work on them. But I was set up to work, and this included, I don't know the exact number, I can't remember, the paintings from the Ogden Museum, which had been brought over. And so part of the dream was working on these paintings, but also I had to make a lot of trips back to New Orleans. And, it was a really sad place with the smell of mold in the air, refrigerators that had been put on the street with decaying food, and that was permeating the air. And that was just part of the scene we're working under. But I immediately began to organize to start working on all these paintings. And this was one of them. This is a painting that belonged to Roger Ogden. And I had restored it, but it had water damage because it had been stored at the building where my studio was. And it's kind of, and it was an interesting thing to me. I've been involved in conservation with some 35 or 36 years. And I had some new education because these paintings I was working on very often had gone through things that I never had encountered or imagined. Paintings that were underwater for 2 or 3 or 4 weeks. And I would have thought that paintings like that would have been total losses. But in a large number of cases, I was able to save them. In some cases, not. But and so I, had to deal with that and to solve those problems. But also, almost all the paintings that had gone through the flooding and been affected by the flooding were covered with the most unimaginable concoctions of things that were in floodwater: chemicals, organic materials, mineral materials. And so these all paintings had to be cleaned because they were just dark black and brown deposits of these substances from the floodwater. In addition to the damage done by the water, it was what was in the floodwater. And so they were very difficult to clean because I had never tried to clean paintings that had been through this kind of condition. And so I had to kind of invent some of my own technology for cleaning these paintings. And my usual chemical solvents were not working very well overall. And just in desperation, I went to the grocery store and bought some vinegar because I thought a lot of these deposits were base minerals, and that worked. Whereas toluene, alcohol, and various other solvents were not working. By very carefully using the vinegar, I was able to break down these deposits and was able to clean the paintings. There were no other ways that I had found to clean some of those paintings. And so, it was a very strange time, as I had said before, and I was having to meet with a lot of clients who had been through these heartbreaking experiences that had changed everybody's lives. And I don't know anybody in New Orleans whose lives have not been changed. Some people went through complete disasters, and their lives were truly devastated. My life was affected and changed, but it could have been far worse. But I would meet with clients and trying to talk to them about their painting and what we could do with them. And in many cases, they just would break into uncontrollable crime. They'd been through such a disaster, and so I was having to look at paintings and trying to console people, and so it was a very intense experience. Now, in working with these paintings, there were varying degrees of damage. This Robert Gordy painting, had been water stained, and they were able to clean that, things like this successfully. In other cases, they were rather extensive restorations that had to take place. This is a corner of one of my classrooms in Mobile. It was a very nice place. I enjoyed working there. Although there were so many paintings around, it was hard to move and to maneuver. And David took some of these pictures of things that had been affected by the storm that I had in the conservation studio in Mobile. These are some things that David took just recently. It's just showing some of the materials of the trade, so to speak. These are chemical solvents, and this is kind of a messy little temple where I've been doing some hand painting, and some of my standard tools. David took pictures of some things that just come in from the historic neurons collection. Some of these damages, these were not. This is more recent. These were not Katrina damages, but it looks very similar to a lot of things I was dealing with bad paint cupping, canvas tears, and things that were very dirty. And this is a painting that had been to Katrina, and it belongs to the Mississippi Museum in Jackson, Mississippi. And the cupping was so severe that the whole surface was distorted, and there's no way to, in this case, to make the paint cupping flatten. And there was a lot of paint loss. And then so this was just a little detail of that David photographs. And this is one that is completed. I think it's 17th century French painting. So these are little details from recent things. Now I have to say, just to kind of I talk a little bit about what's involved with conservation. To be a conservator, is a pretty daunting, overwhelming profession to be in, because we have to know as much as possible with art history, about paintings, about chemistry, and in order to deal with whatever problems that we're presented with. So it takes a long time to accumulate that much knowledge, and we have to have a background for it. And in my case, I had a science background because I first studied engineering and decided that I didn't want to do that, but at least I had the science. So, but the Katrina experience, I had about every conceivable kind of problem to deal with, and part of the process of being a conservator is analyzing the problem and then solving the problems, and so it's such a complete range, and so for 450 paintings to restore, it was an exhausting process, and I have finished them, those 450 paintings in about 2 years, and I was getting some other work in also, but that was it was an experience that I hope never go through again. And so that's kind of a generality about this. And I would be glad to, and I think that David would too, to answer any questions you have or discuss any areas. I don't assume that most of you have much experience with painting and conservation, but and so if you have questions, we can answer these questions.
Like Richard got warmed up because we did a project together. We were asked by the city of New Orleans to conserve and restore all of the paintings of New Orleans mayors in the old city hall downtown, Gallier Hall, and there were 36 of them. And the culmination of this was the unveiling of a new portrait by Martin Morial. So we were ferrying and evaluating and analyzing, and it was everything, I guess, from the early 19th century to the present, not realizing that this would be a warm-up for what you face. But what Richard did was really heroic when you realize that he left his home, moved to another town, and the paintings just started piling in from all over the Gulf Coast, especially from New Orleans. And the institutions received priority with these paintings that I mentioned that we needed for exhibition soon. But as he said, he became psychologist and advisor as well as a painting conservator, which all of us in the arts, as you know, do all the time anyway. But any questions for any?
Yeah, what type, did you use white vinegar or cider vinegar?
No, it was a white vinegar.
White vinegar, okay.
And you know, he was using it very carefully. You know, with the way that I paint paintings, it was with little cotton swabs that I make on the spot, and you use it very sparingly and very gradually, and it worked.
Yeah, I'm
Thank goodness.
Go ahead.
This particular painting that we're looking at now, I assume you did a lot of infill touch-up, but how did you keep the surface from continuing to separate from the canvas?
Well, we have a process that's it's called lining paintings.
Mm-hmm.
You may have heard of lining paintings, and there are various ways to line paintings, but usually what the lining process does is that in the first place, you know, if the canvas is older, it's very fragile, you know, because the fibers are rotted, and so the lining a painting is attaching a new canvas to the back of the old one. With a yeah, this is one actually this is one that was recently lined. It was well, I'll kind of go back and kind of tell you what's going on here, but you know, the lining process reinforces the old weakened canvas. But also, I mean, I've lined paintings a lot of ways, but usually the process I use is called wax resin lining, and so the wax resin adhesive is forced through the new canvas and the old canvas and reattaches all the paint ground on the original painting, and so it stops the paint flicking
Could you speak in the microphone,
now and
please?
then really basically forever.
What you got?
I'm sorry, I didn't.
It's hard to hear. If you
Oh,
speak in
okay.
the microphone.
I can be like the microphone. Okay, so
Well, the lining process is it's a pretty complicated process, although we do it very routinely. This is the one that you see the lining canvas, and that's put on what we call a work stretcher, and it's a temporary stretcher, and that canvas is extremely tight. It's tighter than you can stretch a canvas just with regular canvas pliers, because you want to get all the stretch out of it. And so the principle here is to give support, and all the tension is in the lining canvas, and the painting is attached to that, and it's ironed, and there is no tension on the painting itself. It's kind of tension neutral. And so after that's been ironed, you use an 8-pound iron from the back, and you very, very carefully iron that. And then after it's been lined, it's cut off that stretcher and stretched onto his permanent stretcher. And this is where one had been cut out and stretched into his permanent stretcher. And so this is a very this kind of lining is a very traditional European method of lining paintings, and I learned it in Mexico from a conservative friends in Mexico City. And so they taught me. And so it's a very traditional. It's not high tech, but one advantage of it is that it doesn't flatten the paint. Number two, you can stretch paintings of almost any dimension, and I've lined paintings this way up to about, well, I think the biggest I've lined this way is 16 by 12 feet. It was a huge altar painting in a Catholic church in New Orleans.
Does that method avoid the battling between weaves? Like sometimes if you get a tight weave and a loose weave, one will try to pull it. Does that eliminate the potential shrinkage, or?
Yes, it does.
It does.
It stabilizes it, and then you stretch it onto a very adequate stretcher, so that it expands and contracts to a minimal degree, and so it really does stabilize its whole condition.
Yeah, and I've got another question for both of you. How much trouble did you have with the insurance company supporting you to be able to fund them?
That's another story, isn't it?
Still waiting on claims.
After I made the claim, I submitted the invoices to the Ogden Museum. It took me a 1.5 years to be paid.
And the city, state officials came to us, and it was very important for them to get the city restarted. So to have a major institution up and running, and we were made promises of all types of support, and just hasn't been forthcoming. The insurance companies, and part of my complexity is some of it is through the state. They hired adjusters, and I went through 3 adjusters. One guy would come, and I would bring him up to speed and give him all the information, and nothing would happen. And I would call and ask, and he's gone, and there's another adjuster, and he would start over. And that's happened now 3 times. And I have a significant amount of money that's still tied up in that. And part of it is dysfunction. Part of it is just confusion. And the other part I can't explain.
Yeah,
But
like
we've expended a lot of money that we were promised to be reimbursed that just hasn't been forthcoming.
And I've got one more conservation question. How much stuff did you have on new media? How much work did the museum own on new media? That was just, electronic, video. Was any of that damaged?
No, unfortunately, our damage was small. This is a storage room that was both a temporary holding room and where I put things that were just too large for the in-house storage rooms. And we had temperature, humidity controls checked at twice a week and the rest of it. And the idea that it would ever flood was just incomprehensible. Most of what was damaged there were paintings and some photographs. Unfortunately, the photographs were not historical photographs, and they could be regenerated from the negatives. that survived with the artists. So with the new media, I kind of prioritize, and anything electronic sensitive like that stays in the main vault in the museum in a different setting. So I have size issues, and the architect of our building is one of my good friends, and I love to take him to places where there's a 10-foot door, and then you go 2 stops down, and there's a 7-foot door. And what good is it me to get the 10-foot painting to there and have to stop? And he says, that would cost more money. So there are all sorts of practical issues, but then there's a whole prioritization issues about storage and conservation concerns there. And the only reason the Civil War painting was there in the temporary holding space is it had just been moved from Richard's studio upstairs down there, cycling into another space, and it happened to be caught. But this relining process that he talked about, had it not been relined, it probably would have not been survived, because it was relined and then varnished. So it had both the wax and the relining protection on the back, and then the revarnishing on the front. The frame sustained considerable damage, but when you look at collections and storage, prioritization and protecting things the best is part of your emergency plan.
I want to make a comment about lining paintings, because it's some issues that come up pretty often, and I have a lot of questions about this often. And number one is, should paintings ever be lined? And the answer to that is that all paintings that are going to survive are probably going to have to eventually be lined. But they should never be lined until it's absolutely necessary. And, you know, it shouldn't be lined before it's time. And, you know, so that's often a judgment call, but it's very important, you know, is that we, you know, properly practice, you know, conservation. It's very conservative, and nothing is ever done that does not need to be done. You know, and so it's, you know, part of the, you know, for collectors, the concern is, you know, that they have heard and they've read articles where lined paintings, their value is diminished. And you know, if that principle is observed about not lining paintings until they really have to, well then it becomes kind of a moot issue, because, you know, eventually lining a painting that's very fragile and is losing paint, you know, it really preserves the value. So you know, it's kind of an ethical and professional issue that has to be dealt with all the time, and it's a responsibility that a conservator has to give a proper and good advice on these issues.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.